I remember seeing this child walking with this man down a dark hallway at a motel. And that was the last sighting of her.
The little girl Washington cannot forget. The one with the soulful eyes that seemed to hold a deeper story if only someone had stopped to listen. Relisia Rudd would be 20 years old in a week, but 12 years after she vanished, no one knows where she is.
Relisha.
At just 8 years old, Relisia was teaching all of us how to say and spell her name, the little girl who captured our community's heart. Here she is, part of a documentary on the Playtime Project, filmed just 1 month before she disappeared.
Shelter give us some place to stay.
Let's go back to 2014.
A phone rings. Once, twice. Then a recording, flat and mechanical. The kind of voice that doesn't care what it's interrupting. The number you have dialed is not in service at this time. An officer lowers the phone, says nothing for a second, writes something down. 20 minutes earlier, this was supposed to be a simple call. Confirm a doctor's appointment, close out a welfare check, move on to the next case on a very long list. Now it's the moment everything stops making sense. There is no doctor. There never was a conference in Atlanta. The man on the other end of that line, the one who'd apparently vouched for a sick 8-year-old for over a week, doesn't exist. Not as the person he claimed to be. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., in a building that used to be a hospital and now houses hundreds of families with nowhere else to go, a little girl has been missing for close to a month. Nobody noticed. Not her school, not the people meant to be checking in on her. Not, it would turn out, almost anyone who should have. That silence on the other end of a disconnected line is where this story actually starts. Here's what investigators had. That day in March of 2014, a mother whose story changed 3 times in one conversation, a missing 8-year-old named Relisia Rudd, and a man everyone in her life had quietly agreed to trust completely, a janitor the family had taken to calling with real affection, her godfather. Within 72 hours, that same man would be tied to a second victim, a dead woman, no sign of a struggle, found in a motel room 40 minutes from where Relisia was last seen. This isn't a story about a stranger snatching a child off the street. It's harder than that, because it's slower than that. It's a story about a system that had years of warning signs sitting in plain sight, and a man who understood exactly how to become someone nobody would think to question. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly how a child can disappear inside a building full of people, a school full of teachers, and a family full of people who loved her, and how 12 years later, nobody still knows where she is. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know what city you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always wild seeing how far these stories actually reach. And if true crime documentaries like this one are why you're here, go ahead and subscribe now, because I promise you this case does not end where you think it does. Now let's go back to the beginning. Before any of this made headlines, Relisia Rudd was just one of hundreds of kids living inside a single building the city used as emergency housing for homeless families. The place had a real name, DC General Family Shelter, but Relisia had her own word for it, and a lot more honest than anything on the paperwork. Not once did she call it home the way the city meant it to sound. It's not hard to see why. The building used to be a functioning hospital, and it never quite shook that feeling. Long fluorescent hallways, thin walls, a structure designed for short bursts of crisis that had somehow calcified into long-term life for the families stuck inside it. At its fullest, the shelter housed hundreds of families at once. The number of children alone sometimes climbed past 500. Relisia's family of 6, her mother Shamika, her mother's boyfriend Antonio Wheeler, and her 3 younger brothers ages 7, 5, and 4, shared a single room. With a second family, privacy wasn't part of the arrangement. The neighborhood outside didn't offer much of a break either. The shelter sat wedged between a correctional facility on one side and a treatment facility on the other. Inside, former residents described conditions most people would never quietly accept. Persistent pest problems, bites at night, showers that left skin raw and irritated, heat that came and went with the seasons, sometimes leaving rooms bitterly cold in the dead of winter. On paper, there were safeguards. Visitors needed ID, every floor had its own checkpoint, curfews were enforced, kids weren't supposed to leave without a parent or guardian standing right there, on paper. In practice, former residents tell a different story. Cameras that rarely worked, staffing stretched thin enough that people came and went without ever being logged. Complaints that went nowhere, and some residents say they were flat out warned that pushing too hard on those complaints could get them evicted. Several employees over the years faced accusations ranging from inappropriate conduct with residents to outright financial schemes. Some were let go. The culture, according to the people who actually lived there, never really changed. This is the world Relisia grew up inside. Not a single dramatic failure, 1,000 small ones, stacked on top of each other until nobody could see the shape of the danger anymore. And somewhere in that building, doing a job that came with rules explicitly barring him from any personal contact with the children living there, was a 51-year-old janitor named Khalil Tatum. Nobody thought much of him yet. That's the point. Nobody was supposed to. Relisia was enrolled at Payne Elementary, a few blocks from the shelter, and by early March of 2014, staff had started noticing something wrong. Not a single dramatic absence, a slow collapse, days missed here and there, then whole weeks, a seat that stayed empty, a name that stopped getting called during attendance. On March 5th, a school counselor reached Shamika directly. Shamika actually showed up for the meeting, and then nothing changed. That conversation would turn out to be the last real contact the school ever had with the family before the entire situation came apart. A follow-up call produced an explanation that sounded plausible enough on the surface. Relisia was sick, under a doctor's care, dealing with severe headaches and seizures that were keeping her home. A relative even showed up at the school with a name and a phone number attached to it. A Dr. Tatum. When staff called that number on March 10th, a man picked up and backed the story completely. A neurological issue, ongoing treatment. Following protocol, the school asked for paperwork. They were told it would be dropped off. It never came. By March 13th, the absences had crossed a legal threshold, enough unexcused days that the school was required to report suspected neglect to the city's child welfare agency. Even then, that report got quietly delayed, an act of good faith meant to give the family more time to produce documents that, it would later become painfully clear, never existed at all. One staff member would later admit, flatly, that the delay had been a mistake. 6 days after that, March 19th, someone from the Child Welfare Agency finally showed up at the shelter in person. There was no paperwork waiting for them. There was no doctor's office to call. And as staff started asking around the building, a much colder reality set in. Nobody could actually say when they'd last seen Relisia. Not the neighbors, not the staff, nobody. A month. She'd been gone for the better part of a month, in a building full of people, and it took a school attendance policy finally tripping a wire to get anyone to ask the question out loud. If you think you already know exactly where this story is going, stick around anyway. I promise you, it doesn't end the way you think it does. Comment your theory right now, before the next part changes everything you think you know. Let's keep going. When officers sat down with Shamika on March 19th, her explanation didn't hold up for more than a few sentences. First, she said Relisia was out of state, with the doctor, at a medical conference in Atlanta. An 8-year-old at a medical conference. Officers pushed, gently at first, and almost in the same breath, Shamika's story shifted. She admitted she hadn't actually laid eyes on her daughter in weeks. The last time they'd spoken, she said, was March 17th over the phone. Pushed harder, she offered yet another version. Maybe Relisia was staying with her grandmother, Melissa, or maybe her aunt, Ashley. Officers made the calls. Both women said the exact same thing, independently of each other. They hadn't seen Relisia in weeks. When confronted with just how much her account had shifted in the space of one conversation, Shamika reportedly said she didn't want to file a missing person report at all, allegedly out of fear that involving police would cost her custody of her 3 other children. Whether or not that fear was reasonable, it cost the investigation something that can't be gotten back: time. That night, an officer tried the number for Dr. Tatum one more time, already disconnected. The next morning, March 20th, police finally filed the missing person report, weeks after it should have existed. Investigators would eventually settle on Relisia's last confirmed sighting, March 1st, nearly 3 weeks earlier. And Dr. Tatum turned out to be nobody at all, just Khalil Tatum, the shelter's janitor, a man who'd worked there for 2 years under a policy that explicitly barred him from having any personal contact whatsoever with the children in the building. Everyone investigators talked to seemed to describe a completely different man. Some called him quiet, reliable, forgettable even. Others described someone who got unusually close to certain mothers and their kids, though people noted pointedly, never with boys. and who kept trying to hand out cash and gifts despite it being a flat violation of shelter policy. One mother would later recall celebrating her daughter's 4th birthday in the shelter cafeteria, only to look over and catch Khalil quietly trying to slip the child a $20 bill. That same morning, a tip sent detectives across the state line into Maryland. The tip led to a motel in Oxon Hill, Maryland. Inside one of the rooms, officers found a woman who hadn't survived a gunshot wound. No sign of a struggle. Nothing to suggest she'd fought back or even seen it coming. She was identified as Andrea Tatum, Khalil's wife of 24 years. Court paperwork showed she'd filed for separation just weeks earlier, that February. Her own daughter would later say she believed her mother had finally, after 24 years, been trying to leave him for good. Motel surveillance told its own story. 6 people walked into that room the night before. Khalil, Andrea, 4 others. Under an hour later, only 3 walked back out. The nonprofit that ran the shelter under city contract confirmed it had run a background check on Khalil before hiring him in 2012. Nothing in it had legally stopped him from getting the job, but the record was there, for anyone who'd looked closely enough. 2 separate prison stretches, 1993 to 2003, and again, 2004 to 2011, tied to property crimes. Unauthorized entry, out of Virginia. Under the hiring rules in place at the time, none of it technically disqualified him. It's the kind of detail that shows up again and again in cases like this. A technicality on paper that in hindsight reads like nobody catching it in time. With Tatum's name and history now in the picture, investigators finally had a suspect. They just didn't have him. And they still didn't have Relisia. An Amber Alert went out across the district. An 8-year-old girl, roughly 4 feet tall, 70 to 80 pounds, black hair, brown eyes. An arrest warrant followed almost immediately. Before we go further, a case like this one is hard to sit with, and that's kind of the point. Stories like Relisia's only stay buried if we look away from the uncomfortable parts. So stay with it. And down in the comments, tell me, out of everyone who could have stepped in here, the school, the shelter, the family, the city, who do you think failed her first? I want to hear it. The deeper investigators dug, the more a much larger picture started coming into focus, one that, in hindsight, had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Relisia liked breakfast early. When her mother and stepfather weren't up yet to walk her down, she'd turn to whoever happened to be around. More often than not, in that building, that was Khalil Tatum. He'd walk her to the cafeteria, along with other kids from the shelter. He gave her things, spending money, a tablet, movie tickets, even a trip to see Disney on Ice. On the surface, it looked like kindness. Investigators looking back would describe it as something else entirely. The groundwork predators lay long before anyone realizes what's actually happening. Shamika would later say she'd left Relisia in her own mother's care. Melissa said that never happened. In the aftermath, the 2 women blamed each other publicly, neither one willing to carry the weight of it alone. Melissa remembered the exact moment she first noticed Tatum's attention toward her granddaughter, and asked her daughter, point blank, who he was. Shamika's answer was simple. That's Mr. Tatum. He's got a granddaughter Relisia likes to play with, it's fine. And every single time Relisia came back from being with him, she said the same thing, that she'd had fun with Mr. Tatum's granddaughter. It was a tidy enough answer that nobody thought to ask a second question. Melissa would later admit something uncomfortable herself, that the family had simply gotten used to people being unusually kind to Shamika's kids. So Tatum's attention never registered as strange. Melissa had gotten into his car alone herself, more than once. Never thought twice about it. Overnight stays at his house became routine, always framed around the idea that his granddaughter would be there too. Antonio's own mother would later say that both he and Shamika knew exactly how much time Relisia was spending with Tatum, and that he always, without fail, brought her back when he said he would. Eventually, the family gave him a title that said everything about how completely they'd come to trust him. They called him Relisia's Godfather. This is the part of the story that's hardest to look at directly, because there's no single moment where anyone did anything that looked, from the outside, like a mistake. Nobody handed a stranger their daughter. They handed her to someone who had spent months, quietly, patiently, deliberately, making sure he wasn't a stranger at all. As the search dragged on with nothing to show for it, officials began saying carefully and publicly what nobody wanted to hear. that too much time had already passed, and the odds of a different outcome kept shrinking by the day. Fake social media accounts started circulating, including one impersonating Tatum himself, falsely claiming Relisia was his own daughter. Police shut it down fast, but it added noise to an already chaotic situation. Search teams converged on Kenilworth Park, nearly 700 acres of dense trails, water, and overgrowth in northeast DC. Cadaver dogs and canine units moved through it for days, suspending the search each night, only to start again at first light. Nothing. By this point, investigators had settled on a firm date for the last confirmed sighting of Relisia, March 1st, outside a motel the city used for temporary housing. What happened the very next day would end up haunting the entire investigation. Security footage placed Tatum inside a hardware store, buying heavy-duty trash bags, a shovel, and a bottle of lye. For investigators watching that footage, it closed off any real possibility that this case was heading somewhere good. Not long after, he was spotted near Kenilworth Park. Over the following weeks, he kept showing up around the city here and there, but never again with Relisia. Long stretches passed when nobody saw him at all. The Amber Alert itself became its own small controversy. Officials initially claimed it had reached up and down the East Coast, from Pennsylvania and Delaware all the way to Florida. A later investigation by a local news station couldn't find a single station outside the DC area that had actually run anything on the case during that window. It took a full week, until March 27th, before the story aired nationwide at all. Eventually, the police chief acknowledged the truth. The real formal Amber Alert had only ever gone out within DC itself. Everything beyond that had just been an informal heads-up between agencies, not an actual multi-state alert. Shamika finally spoke publicly. She defended her decision not to go to police sooner, and insisted she still believed her daughter could be found alive. She pushed back hard on the idea that she'd ever refused to file a missing person report, insisting nobody had ever asked her to. Asked who she thought had failed Relisia, she pointed first at the school and at the city, arguing that if officials had pushed harder for the doctor's real identity from the start, this whole story might have gone differently. On March 25th, the FBI released the piece of footage that would come to define the entire case. Dated February 26th, a motel near the shelter. Relisia in pink boots and a purple jacket, a plastic bag swinging at her side, walking beside Khalil Tatum. Family members offered an explanation, that the bag held nothing more than a swimsuit, that she was headed to a pool day with Tatum's granddaughter. For a moment, that story gave everyone something to hold on to. It didn't hold up for long. On March 30th, the search escalated again, cadaver dogs and dive teams working the full 700 acres of Kenilworth Park, crews checking abandoned buildings around its edges. Still nothing. Billboards carrying Relisia's photo and Tatum's went up along the highway between Maryland and Georgia, and the FBI added a $25,000 reward. The police chief chose her words carefully now, calling the operation a recovery effort, language that made the department's private assessment clear without anyone having to say it outright. The warrant against Tatum, tied to his wife's death, stayed active. He was considered armed, and investigators quietly began hearing other accounts too, reports that Tatum had had inappropriate contact with other children at the shelter over the years, a detail that made his 2 years of access to that building even harder to sit with. The search for Khalil Tatum ended not long after, during another sweep of Kenilworth Park. Investigators found a shed near a soccer field. Inside was a man who'd been dead for what they estimated was somewhere between a day and a half and several days. No note. He was identified through a distinctive tattoo on his left arm. Ballistics confirmed the gun beside him was the same one used to kill his wife, meaning both deaths had come from the same hand. Not everyone accepted that ending at face value. Melissa gave an interview afterward, saying she didn't believe Tatum had killed his wife at all, that one of the other people seen entering that motel room might be responsible instead. She went further, pointing out that the shed where he was found had already been searched once before, during the hunt for her granddaughter. To her, that alone made the whole ending feel wrong. She raised the possibility, publicly, that his body had been placed there deliberately, after the fact, that someone had wanted the case to end exactly the way it did. Investigators never publicly substantiated that theory, but it's worth sitting with for a second, because it points at something true about this entire case. The ending everyone got was also, conveniently, the one ending that closed every remaining question. with the one man who had the answers no longer able to give them. One note before this section: this part covers documented family court and child welfare history, including a separate case from 1992 involving a different child. It's kept factual and restrained, rather than graphic, enough to carry the weight of the story without unnecessary detail. Here's the part of this story that's hardest to sit with. This wasn't a family the system never noticed. It was a family the system had been watching, on and off for years, without ever fully acting. Shamika had Relisia in October of 2005, at 19 years old. Records show that before her daughter had even turned 1, a caseworker had already visited the home and documented real concerns: feeding problems, poor living conditions, injuries nobody could clearly explain. That caseworker's own notes made clear how worried she was. Nothing formal followed. At the time, what had been written down wasn't judged serious enough on its own to act on. Not everyone who crossed paths with Relisia looked past her, though. At her first school, a cheerleading coach named Shannon Smith noticed things that stuck with her. How much the little girl craved being held, how often she needed a proper bath before her day could even start. So Shannon made a habit of it, walking her to the nurse's office some mornings to get cleaned up, having her over some weekends, slipping in an extra toy or outfit whenever she was already shopping for her own granddaughter. Nobody asked her to. She just did it. Relisia found something similar at the Homeless Children's Playtime Project, an after-school program built around play, where she was the kid who showed up early to help set up and stayed late to help clean. Like being useful somewhere mattered to her, almost as much as the program itself. One of the program's co-founders later pointed to Relisia's case as proof of something bigger, that homeless kids inside that same system had been going without real support for years, long before her name ever made the news. None of this instability started with Relisia either. Shamika had another child from an earlier relationship, with a man named Irving Rudd, and 2 more sons later on, with Antonio Wheeler. Somewhere along the way, the family got evicted, and was briefly taken in by Shamika's sister Ashley, an arrangement that eventually fell apart over friction tied to Antonio, which is what pushed the family into the shelter system in the first place. By 2010, caseworkers had logged even more red flags: concerns about inadequate medical care, reports that the kids were regularly left alone, conditions caseworkers didn't consider safe. Then, in November of 2013, police were called after one of Relisia's younger brothers was reportedly hurt. A caseworker's notes described him being pushed down and hit. The children reportedly told investigators their mother often left them on their own and was physically and verbally hard on them. Once Relisia's case became public, the Child Welfare Agency took heavy criticism on 2 fronts: for not moving faster once her school absences piled up, and for never pulling the children out of a home that had been flagged as unsafe for years. To really understand how deep this pattern ran, you have to go back one more generation, to Shamika's own childhood. She was taken from her mother Melissa at just 9 years old, during a period when Melissa was struggling with addiction, and cycled through a series of foster homes alongside her younger siblings. As a teenager, she was diagnosed with a mild intellectual disability, and spent time in a psychiatric facility, where staff described her as withdrawn, someone who cried easily and rarely made eye contact. In 1998, one foster family asked that she be removed from their home over ongoing behavioral issues. More than anything, it was a childhood spent constantly moving from place to place, never really landing anywhere. After Relisia disappeared, her 3 younger brothers were placed into state custody, officials having decided that a home with this many years of red flags on file could no longer be considered safe for any of them. Relisia's biological father, Irving Rudd, had actually petitioned twice for full custody of her and one of her brothers, back in 2012, 2 years before she went missing. The courts granted him visitation only. At the time, that probably looked like simple caution. Looking back at everything else on his record, it reads more like a decision the courts had good reason to make, because Irving carried history of his own, the kind the family may never have fully understood. Back in 1992, a 17-month-old daughter of his from an earlier relationship suffered injuries severe enough while in his care that she didn't survive. Law enforcement was involved immediately, and investigators concluded the injuries hadn't happened by accident. A jury found Irving guilty of manslaughter. He served time and was released in 2002, years before Relisia was ever born. And somehow, None of it stayed in the past. It resurfaced anyway, in a custody ruling handed down a decade later, from a court that clearly hadn't forgotten what he'd done. By the time she disappeared, Relisia had already been born into a family carrying generations of hardship that had nothing to do with her. Circumstances that go a long way toward explaining just how vulnerable this family already was, long before Khalil Tatum ever entered the picture. None of it, though, answers the one question that actually mattered. Where was she? By April of 2014, City Hall had ordered a full review of how every agency involved had handled the warning signs leading up to Relisia's disappearance. The review dug into what each agency had done, hunting for changes that might stop a case like this from happening again. What it concluded didn't sit well with a lot of people in the community, that even if every recommendation in it had been fully carried out, there was no guarantee Relisia's story would have ended any differently. Her own family pushed back against that conclusion harder than almost anyone. What did change in the end was something you could actually measure. The shelter itself shut down for good. The city overhauled its entire emergency housing system, moving towards smaller facilities built with real oversight and real support. The kind of structure that might have caught a missing 8-year-old a whole lot sooner than an entire month. In the years since, online theories about trafficking or exploitation have circulated widely. Law enforcement has never confirmed any connection to that theory, and it remains completely unproven to this day. Still, people who work in child advocacy keep pointing back to the broader pattern on display here. The gifts, the slow building of familiarity, using another child to make a target feel at ease. Patterns worth recognizing early, they argue, long before a case ever gets anywhere close to an ending like this one. Today, the case is still open. Relisia Rudd has never been found. Somewhere along the way, without anyone ever saying it outright, the language around this case quietly shifted from an active rescue effort to a recovery operation, which told you everything about which outcome investigators had come to expect. The truth about what happened to her most likely died in that shed, alongside the one man who knew it. If this is the first video of ours you've caught, this is exactly the kind of story this channel was built to tell. True crime documentaries that go past the headline into everything the system missed along the way. Subscribe if you want more of them. And if you've got a theory on what really happened to Relisia, what you think that shed was really hiding, or where you think this story actually goes, put it in the comments below. Because right now, whatever the real answer is, it's still out there.